Alors, mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen,
welcome to meeting number 35 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 26, 2022, the committee is meeting to study fraudulent calls in Canada. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sous forme hybride conformément à
today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of Thursday, June 23, 2022. With us today, we have Ian Scott, Chairperson and CEO of the CRTC, Stephen Haroun, Chief Compliance and Enforcement Officer, and Alain Garneau, Director, Telecommunications Enforcement, Compliance and Enforcement Sector. Thank you for being with us today. Before the INDU committee, without further ado, I'll give Mr. Scott the floor for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I just want to note that we're not hearing very loudly the volume from your speaker. I'll see how it is with the other members, but it wasn't very easy to hear you speaking. Bonjour, merci beaucoup. Nous vous remercions.
Hello, and thank you for inviting us to speak on the topic of fraudulent calls in Canada, an issue that has been of particular concern for the CRTC. As you know, we participated in this committee study in March 2020, and we are pleased to provide an update on our activities. I'm joined today by Stephen Haroun, the CRTC's Chief Compliance and Enforcement Officer, and Alain Garneau, Director of Telecommunications Enforcement. Unwanted calls, which often are fraudulent in nature, seek to not only take advantage of Canadians, but also undermine their confidence in the telecommunications system. One of our priorities over the last few years has been to better protect Canadians and prevent as many of these calls from reaching them as possible.
No single solution, no silver bullet that will put an end to this scourge. That's why we have put in place a robust strategy that relies on a number of different technical and regulatory policy solutions. To begin, for the past 2 years, telecom providers have been required to block numbers that we refer to as malformed numbers, that contain numbers that wouldn't normally be part of a phone number. Simple example being 000 in 4 digits. You know, that is obviously not a real number, and they get blocked automatically so that they don't get through. And alternatively, providers could also offer their subscribers call filtering services, which provide similar but more advanced call management features. Callers can also act in bad faith, though, using fake caller IDs to conceal their identities and their intentions, a practice known as ID spoofing, and one that has grown phenomenally in recent years. And to combat that illegitimate practice, we required service providers to implement Stir Shaken in June of last year, something we discussed with this committee previously. Essentially, that technology will enable providers to confirm whether a caller's identity can be trusted by authenticating and verifying the caller ID information for IP-based calls. And this will allow Canadians to determine which calls are legitimate and which need to be treated with some degree of caution, kind of a red light, yellow light, green light. We're awaiting the first annual reports from the providers, and that'll help us assess how implementation has progressed and help us understand whether or not the results, or what the results, I guess more particularly, are revealing to us. What we do know, however, is that many of the technical issues that we were confronting and the industry were confronting have been overcome, and also smaller providers are coming on board to provide similar protections. Another element in the battle against these calls is artificial intelligence, which is a promising new weapon in the fight against fraudulent calls. Some time ago, Bell Canada developed a solution using artificial intelligence to block calls that were confirmed as fraudulent in the company's network. And we allowed them to do a trial. We approved a trial. And encouraged by the results of that 15-month trial, we approved an application by them to implement that technology on a permanent basis last December. To date, that service, that application, has blocked more than 1.5 billion calls at source. And they've been intercepted. So that's 1.5 billion times you didn't have to answer your phone and hear something you didn't want to hear. Le CRTC travaille également avec l'industrie des télécommunications.
We work to implement processes allowing to retrace calls to their point of origin in the network. The industry conducted a trial that yielded positive results, and so we directed providers to begin the rollout of the process towards its full deployment. The intelligence that we will be able to gather by pinpointing the origin of nuisance calls will help us to improve our enforcement efforts. Of course, we continue to oversee the national Do Not Call list. Canadians have registered more than 14.6 million numbers on this list since it launched in 2008. Complaints submitted through the list operator help to inform our outreach efforts and our enforcement actions. Our ongoing work with the industry, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, and the RCMP enables us to exchange information on nuisance communications. We are also in regular contact with a number of federal departments and agencies, including the Canada Revenue Agency, the Competition Bureau, Shared Services Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, and the Communication Security Establishment. Through this engagement, we can warn Canadians of illegitimate campaigns in a timely way to help them avoid becoming victims of fraud. This committee is well aware, however, that the issue of fraudulent calls is not limited to Canada.
Problem in many countries, particularly English-speaking countries, and in the United States alone. I think I've shared these numbers with you before. It's estimated that there is something in the order of 2,100 robocalls every second, and something approaching 50% of those may be fraudulent. In particular, we have established formal arrangements to share information and expertise and to provide investigative support with our counterparts in the U.S., the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And through all of these initiatives and with the help of industry and our domestic and international enforcement partners, we are making significant progress in protecting Canadians and restoring faith and confidence in the telecommunications system. With that, I'm happy my colleagues and I will attempt to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. So before we start, can you just repeat that statistics you just mentioned? I saw.
And it changes all the time. This is a U.S. statistic, but approximately, used to be I lost where I was. Hang on.
So I think it was the number of calls
Yeah,
per
no, I'm
minute,
just
or?
looking for 2,100 per second are robocalls. Those are United States figures, but they're very proportionally similar in Canada. We have very similar patterns. And of those 2,100 robocalls, obviously a portion, in fact, a slight majority, are legitimate telemarketing, but that means something close to 50% are fraudulent. So think of it as 1,000 calls a second are fraud.
pourquoi, malgré tous les efforts,
So why is it, despite all these efforts, we're still receiving these calls, and it seems to be going up? Well, I'm going to give the floor to begin the discussion and questions. Michael Graham, 6 minutes.
The CRTC for being here today. I read the report from the last time the subject came up with interest, and I guess I should start by saying thank you for all the work that you have done on this file. I think there is broad consensus among all parties that reducing fraud is a good thing for everyone, regardless of one's political stripe. Based on my reading of the report, I got the impression that you've come a long way over the last decade or so, and I think that if someone starts up a fraudulent call center in, say, Regina, which is my home city, and all of my victims are in Saskatoon, I would suspect that there's a very good chance that the fraudsters would get caught. But I also read that a great number of the fraudulent calls originate overseas, and which brought me to recommendation number 4 in the report, that these preventative measures should be included in future and ongoing free trade agreements. So let's start with the do not call list. Can you expand and elaborate on how the do not call list can or should be integrated with future free trade agreements?
So I think we probably should start by sort of dividing some things up, and my colleagues will assist me. Just, do not call really relates to telemarketing, and we have a set of rules around it. And then we have CASL, the anti-spam legislation, and that goes to other types of communications. So we just should sort of watch the terminology. So what Do Not Call does is it establishes a system in Canada for Canadians to put their phone on a list that will stop them from being called by legitimate telemarketers. And we police that. So insofar, and there's large uptake. My colleagues can give you more specific statistics if you wish. I told you roughly how many numbers. It's in excess of 14 million Canadians have their number on it. There's an exemption for charities and surveys. There's an exemption for political parties that you granted yourselves. We do get lots of complaints about how come I still get calls by. We'll leave that alone. It is the will of Parliament, and that is fine, of course. But that's not the problem. The problem, of course, is those who either decline, legitimate telemarketers who fail to sign up, or illegitimate ones. The first case we pursue. We get complaints, we identify them, we track them down. They either sign up or we fine them. And we're pretty good at that, I'll be honest. The second case is they're illegitimate. They're not playing, and they could be foreign or they could be domestic. And that kind of brings us into that other category where lots of activities are coming from abroad. And what we do there, it's not so much an issue of free trade agreements. It's an issue of one, establishing cooperative mechanisms with other countries, which we've been doing. And I recently revised and modernized agreements with both the United States and Australia to enhance our cooperation. And secondly, initiatives like Call Trace that I referred to in my remarks will help us figure out where these calls are coming from. After that, if they're coming from a particular part of the world, then we have to pursue it with foreign officials. And that goes to our enforcement partners and the Department of Justice. And at that point, it gets more difficult and is, in fact, largely out of our hands.
Let's maybe start with the United States. Is Canada's Do Not Call list currently being shared with telemarketing firms in the United States? And is there a reciprocal agreement in place so that Canadians have to abide by American laws as well?
Stephen, you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. And that's a really great question. fundamental to the list, I'll go back just a little bit of clarification there, is, telemarketers have to buy the list of numbers, right, to ensure they don't call Canadians. So I think you're right. Most Canadian companies, legitimate, will purchase that list. They will not call people on that list. But that's for anyone calling Canadians. So we have American telemarketing firms who register on the list. We have foreign telemarketing companies. I think of last year, there was like 943 telemarketers registered, to purchase the list. Do my rough math here, about 50 of those are outside of Canada. Most of them in the US, but we get some from the UK, some from Morocco. So they are aware of the rules and they purchase the list. And the same goes vice versa. Canadian telemarketing firms, they have to abide by those rules in the US.
And so the recommendation in the report suggested that these measures should be included in current and future free trade agreements. But would you suggest that other treaties outside of free trade agreements might be more effective, or what do you think would work better?
I think it may be outside of our area of expertise to determine how best. The way that we are pursuing it is through bilateral and potentially multilateral agreements between similar agencies. So the regulatory authorities in those other countries, and I recognize, our answers are going quite long, and I don't want to use up all of your time. I beg the indulgence of the chair for a second. That we will work with those agencies, and potentially there is some room, and I've been having discussions with some of our partners about potentially making some of those arrangements multilateral, because this scourge is expanding. I'll be frank, North America was sort of a hot spot for many years, and we see it growing particularly quickly in other English-speaking countries, but it's also growing in Asia, French-speaking countries, and so on. And so we're working with those partners, and that's where our focus has been.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now turn to MB Dong.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Scott. Good to see you, and welcome to other witnesses as well. I just want to quickly follow up to on Michael's question. You talked about how telemarketers get their list, but what we are focusing here are criminals, are not legitimate businesses, right? So my first question is technically, how would these criminal groups get access to these lists and constantly update the list?
Thank you for the question, and I'm not correcting you, but I get corrected by my staff all the time to make sure I don't refer to people as criminals. There are people engaging in activities with malicious intent, but they're not criminals unless, I guess, they're convicted of such. I guess it's really different. They're not using the list. The point is, when you get calls, whether it is spoofed numbers or other ones who are ultimately engaging in fraud, they don't care about a list. They're using equipment, and Alain, you can help me here. They're using equipment to simply just random dials, and it typically is sequential. They'll sit there and go, I'm going to dial everybody with a cell phone 3-digit number of 889.
Right.
And then they start dialing them all.
Got it. And the chair mentioned that what we've seen since the pandemic is, the activities of calls and text messages, emails are on the rise.
Yes.
And I'm really concerned about the newcomer group and more vulnerable populations, seniors, whatnot, because they're getting more clever. Whenever there's a new policy being announced, they're very quick. The next day you get, do you want how access your CRA rebate or something like that?
Yes.
And they're very clever. So my question is, what have you done, or what do you know about the industry has done to protect the vulnerable population in Canada?
No, wonderful question. Thank you. We do several things, and again, I'll invite my colleagues to add. The first thing we do is obviously try and limit.
Can you give us some stats, maybe later on, to the committee on what resource have you spent on protecting specifically for the more vulnerable population? Because I have a few more questions. You mentioned that you work with other departments of the government, RCMP and whatnot, and I don't expect you to answer the resource that they have dedicated to fight fraud calls. But how much has CRTC and the telecom industry spent on annual basis to fight fraud calls? Do you know if there's a number?
All right, I'll try and answer the two questions if I can. So first, our focus, first of all, is obviously attacking the problem at its root, using a variety of solutions with the carriers to try and limit the calls. So that, as I've described, is the first course of action. And the second course of action, and you're right, it's especially important with more vulnerable populations, new Canadians who may be less familiar with the system and authorities, elderly people, and so on. And we use education tools. We work carefully with other departments. You mentioned CRA, so during tax season, we work with them to put out messages. We also have an intelligence branch that is collecting information, so we spot the latest trends, patterns. We share that with law enforcement. We share that with the public through tweets, through information. If I can quickly just go to the last one, I'd have to take an undertaking with respect to numbers. We don't track it in that way. We don't keep, how much do I spend on intelligence gathering versus getting customer complaints. Obviously, we could provide you with statistics from the Commission on Stephen's group and his part of our budget, but we could only give you macro numbers.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. The reason why I'm asking this, I think the public wanted to know how much government agencies are, they want a number, are spending to fight these scams, and whether or not from the public, from the accountability aspect, whether or not we're yielding the result that we're aiming for. Because if we don't have a target, we don't have a sort of a goal, it's really difficult to achieve anything. You talked about working with RCMP. Last year, do you know of how many convictions came out of these investigations? Like when people report fraud and they're getting investigated on, what happens next? What's the process? And how many convictions? Then we can talk about whether or not there needs to be amendment to Criminal Act or whatnot. Like I don't even know how many convictions there has been. I haven't seen any on news.
No, to be clear, we don't have that information, and you would have to ask law enforcement agencies or perhaps the Justice Department. That isn't our role. We're not doing that. We are where we suspect, for example, criminal fraud. We would share that information and provide it to law enforcement agencies so that they can pursue it. How many of those investigations bear fruit, or how many convictions you'd have to raise that with the RCMP or other law enforcement.
I want to get your advice on, as parliamentarians, what can we do in terms of amending laws, make it tougher, make it broader or more updated to fight this phenomenon? Like to me, all the good things I'm hearing, the progress I'm hearing, it's not a change in the direction of all these criminal activities happening. Like where should we spend more energy or more resource on? Is it law enforcement?
That's a fair. Pardon me. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Please.
Fair question. I'm going to ask my colleagues to add. I'll give you two. I'm a good bureaucrat. I'd never say no to more money, and I'm sure Stephen and Alain would like to have more colleagues. So if you'd like to send some more money to the CRTC, we will use it properly. I can assure you of that. But simply adding more people doesn't solve the problem. We focus first we can focus on education and compliance. We try and get people to abide by the rules, educate them. As I said, pass on where we have information about fraudulent activities and where we discover those kinds of actions, we pass it on to law enforcement. One area I would say we definitely would definitely assist us is more flexibility or an enhanced ability to share information with other players, with other government departments and agencies, and perhaps international partners. We're very
Can you name a
restricted
few,
in
just very
information
quickly,
sharing.
because I think I'm done with my time. Can you name a few?
But I'll, if I can indulge and give them, perhaps since we have a little bit of a longer time, Chairman.
It's
can
Thursday
ask
afternoon,
my
I feel,
colleague just to give us one or two examples. Mr. Haroon, what do you want? More money? Yeah, forget that one.
Say, more money always. I think our challenge is, we share lots of aggregate information with law enforcement partners, municipal, provincial, and federal. For us to say, okay, here's a campaign, very specific details we're unable to do on any of those levels. So I'm not sure what piece of legislation that is, but that information sharing to very specifically go after this person or this thing is something we're unable to do right now under our legislation.
Thank you very much. We'll now.
Just to add a few points on what Ian mentioned, I would say speaking about the how much we spend on this. The only thing I can say for sure is when we set up the NCL, the do not call list, we also create the do not call operator. We set up, and the role of the operator is to, of course, compile complaint, receive complaint, share the complaint with us, but also to collect the portion of the fee that the CRTC need to execute his mandate. And if I have to put an amount on it, it's roughly it's in the DNCL report. It's 3.3 million. Is it enough? Is it that's another question. It's not
That's
mine.
the cost of running that particular program.
And I echo Ian comment and Stephen. It's a global problem. We need collaboration. We need cooperation. And if we don't have the tool in our hand to sit at the same table as the RCMP or the other law enforcement agency, you must understand that the regime, it's a civil regime, actually. We're not police officer. I don't have gun. Stephen doesn't have gun. So when sometime the modus operandi is a mix of extortion and it's a mix of. At one point, it became very difficult for us to sit at the same table and share openly information with law enforcement agency.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. Non, ça va, pas de problème. Je passerai maintenant.
That's fine. Mr. Lemire, 6 minutes. I'll be the last to be able to reproach. But when we were doing the last study in French in Quebec, we'll have a little bit of an advantage. If an Anglophone calls us, we know that it's probably fraud. But nonetheless, in our 2022 report, the committee wanted greater cooperation between the government organizations, so the CRTC, the RCMP, the Competition Bureau, and the Department of Innovation, Canada. We heard a lot of solutions, but this required an intervention on behalf of the consumer so that they would detect the call and the fraud. On November 30th, 2021, you announced that there would be a new standard for telecommunications organizations with regards to spoof calls. Also, you adhered to the stir-shaken standard. So did I understand that Bell responded, but did the other telecommunications providers deploy any efforts? Where are they at? Do you have any initiatives in order to fight against fraud for consumers?
Les grands fournisseurs.
Yes, all the large providers and others. Alain, would you answer? Yes, I can add to that. Ian spoke to Bell, and this is a great example of the industry taking things into hand. Rogers also has been working on this and is associated with ARIA, and algorithms are used in order to inform the recipient of the call of the identity, or at least to allow the person receiving the call to detect if it looks like a legitimate call or not. But we must understand that stir-shaken does not have as an objective of blocking calls. It will allow the person receiving the call to make an informed decision if the call was validated. If it received the highest level of validation, A, B, or C, and I won't go into great detail, but the role of the service provider will have to, as a role, to authenticate the call, to say, this is my client. I will certify that it is Mr. Ian Scott that is calling you. And the person receiving the call can then, it will be confirmed by the service provider. You can answer, and it will be this person calling and not someone in Europe or someone trying to conduct fraud. No, because we had spoken about the difficulty for smaller players to implement these solutions. So correct me, on a smartphone it is easier, at home it's harder, and we know that elderly people are the most vulnerable, and they probably receive more calls than anyone, and they have a landline. Are there any solutions to try to help for residential landlines? I'm going to back up a little bit to provide more detail. We dealt with the first level and the IP, the voice over IP calls, and the reason is simple. In Canada, the network is very spread out, the time division, and it's and we have to understand that imposing on providers to migrate towards the IP network has associated costs, and so we had to go forward progressively. So this will be the next step. In the U.S., they have mandated and implemented the certification of calls, even if the call is going through a TDM network. But in Canada, this is the approach that we've used, and we have to understand that the Canadian market is much smaller than the U.S. market. So also there's access to technological solutions. And for smaller players or smaller service providers, lately the CRTC has requested the Canadian Governance Authority to increase coverage of service providers so that they will have easier access to this. So there are other smaller players that are resellers, and they will be able to benefit under the aegis of the provider. So the service provider that they're dealing with will be able to validate the calls for several smaller providers. So I understand that you're satisfied by the industry's efforts, but now at this step, are you also satisfied of the cooperation between government organizations? Can things be implemented to reinforce this agreement? Or is this an issue?
I
think that generally speaking, we have cooperation. As Alain was saying, our limit is perhaps information exchange. We do have limits there in the Act. Well, let's hope that we'll be able to do more. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Mr. Massey.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses to be here today. And maybe my first intervention can be asking our analysts to look at the 15 recommendations that were passed on the previous report and put that as part of a package to ourselves as whether they were acted upon. There's 15 in total. And from that, maybe I'll go to Mr. Scott, was recommendation number 5 about legislation for information sharing with yourselves in the RCMP. Was there ever any reach out by any government department, a minister, or a bridging to deal with that? That was based upon your testimony from last session of this, where we were looking at sharing that information, because it is, as you noted, a big issue, and jurisdiction is still there.
Yes, thank you for the question. I'll ask Mr. Haroon to add, but I just start by saying that we have an ongoing, discussion with those partners. But as you would well know, opportunities to change, to revise legislation don't arise as often. And as of yet, we have not had an opportunity to have a fundamental review of the legislative provisions, but it has been communicated and recognized. Obviously, I don't speak for the minister, and the ministry responds to the recommendations of the committee. But I would say that we certainly feel that we have been heard and that they are aware of the challenge. Stephen, do you deal with the department on a more regular basis? Anything to add?
No, and like nothing official, as Mr. Scott has indicated, but we continue to work with our law enforcement partners to the best of our ability. We would welcome that change. We welcome that recommendation.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that we can control in all of this, and I don't like the characterization of this issue as nuisance calling. I know constituents of mine that have committed suicide after falling subject to predication and losing of financial means related to this, and shame and so forth. And so it's pretty serious. And I'm just wondering, with regards to, I guess, the communication element again, how strung are you in terms of what we could advance in terms of next steps on this? And I really applaud your efforts to move what you have forward. If we can actually get that, maybe we instigate the privacy commissioner to intervene, perhaps to make sure that there's proper guidelines and confidence. But I see that as, again, low-hanging fruit for us to take advantage of, and nothing that costs us money, but also something we can control.
Let me take a step back. If I use the word nuisance calling, first of all, I'm making that reference to certain kinds of calls. These are grave issues. There is no doubt about that. I generally refer to it as unwanted communications. We have other challenges about getting broadband to everyone and wireless to everyone. This is the ones where you want to stop unwanted communications and protect consumers. And that's what we're endeavoring to do. And we will work with anyone in that regard. I don't know that there is that engaging with the privacy commissioner, for example, is going to. If I can just finish that.
No, actually, no, because you're going on this. You're right. My time's short, and you're going on an. Here's what I'm trying to get in, and I'll segue this. You mentioned about resources, right? Where, if we're going to get some bang for our buck, so to speak, like what are we looking at in terms of, if we do, say, for example, put $1 million into the CRTC specifically to fraud or whatever, I don't know what it is, or can you come up with a plan so we can, as legislators, look at that and then see what potential results we get? Because you have made some good progress. And so what I'm looking for is easy steps that we can do right away to deal with this. And so that's kind of where I'm trying to go, Mr. Scott.
Understand. With respect, if there were easy steps to go, we'd go there. And I don't think we're not poor, and we've applied the resources we have effectively. But this is, as technology evolves, people with bad intentions and criminal intentions use technology, to subvert the system. And all of us can use more funding and apply more horsepower. But the measures we're taking are all effective. And we would simply do more of what we're doing. If we recognize something was obvious and would have an immediate impact, honestly, we would be working on it in that direction. And we do. We're reaching out all the time with our partners to try and expand and do better, do what we do better.
Do you have a number on terms of how much administrative monetary penalties have been added over the last couple of years since the study was done? Is there a number that we can get from the committee on that? I guess what I'm looking for is, this is often seen as, there's a lot of preventive measures can be made and will affect their economy in a very positive way, as well as disrupt this. So I'm just wondering, what's our cost benefit for this? Do you have a number that could be shared?
Stephen can give you a general number, and we'll follow up if you'd like with specifics. But I'd just like to preface it by saying our first order of business is prevention, education, trying to seek compliance. We use enforcement as it should be, as a secondary measure when we're talking about do not call and so on. So that is the way we approach enforcement. But Stephen, can you give a ballpark at this point?
And it's in our annual Do Not Call Us report. To date, we're at about $11 million over the last 10 years. In the past year, it's been about $600,000. But I think the point to make here, and that Ian was alluding to, is, these are the administrative monetary penalties that companies have, willingly or been charged with because they have violated the telemarketing rules, right? So these are the legitimate players who are, if you will, paying for the sins of the past and, we didn't buy the list, we didn't call the right people at the right time, etc. I think what you're speaking to, Mr. Massey, is more the fraud-related side of this piece, the 50% of the fraud, that's not where we can, apply our administrative monetary penalties. And if I can go back just to your previous question, Mr. Massey, I think what's important to understand is we're a civil regime. You could give me $10 million tomorrow. I'd be very happy because I could have the entire CRTC working on telemarketing cases and anti-spam cases. However, we are a civil regime, not a criminal regime. So it still may not have the impact you want on the fraud side.
I'm going to interrupt right here. But what I want is a proper business plan. You represent the public, the CRTC, and you're coming here. I can invent numbers as well, too. And sorry, I'm a little upset with this, but present us a business plan in terms of what you can do and how effective it can be. I don't know exactly whether it's 10 million or 2 million or 1 million. This is pretty serious. A priority is me as a member of parliament. I think a lot of other members of parliament. Then put a plan together and show us exactly what it is. That's what you're supposed to be doing. So I know my time is up.
With respect, Mr. Massey, we file a report with Parliament,
okay,
and it has all of that information.
You're at committee here, and you're throwing out that you need more resources, and then there's 10 million, and there's other, and all I'm asking for is a simple plan. So you're really seriously, you're going to fall back on you. I'm supposed to read that report or have that at my fingertips right now.
I didn't ask for more money. I was answering a question with respect to what would help. We, as Mr. Haroon just said, we can give you those numbers, and those numbers are contained in our report to Parliament. And I think there is good value for money with respect to the telemarketing regime. Alain told you it's a cost recovery basis with respect to telemarketers. As to the criminal side of this, or the elements where they're engaging in criminal activity, obviously there are no numbers. That's how would you possibly estimate that?
We'll have the opportunity to get back to this, Mr. Massey, if you want in another round of questions, because we're way over time again. I'll now move to Mr. Deltel pour 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming here. When I was a journalist, I was saying, well, when things are great, they're short and sweet. But I'd like to tell you that, generally speaking, when we have questions on these calls, we can have excellent tools, we can have an unacceptable situation, and we're all political people here. We've all been through an election, and we've all used robocalls, I believe. And I was very impressed to see how this could be efficient, honestly. I was very... I finally accepted to spend some money for robocalls during my campaign, and perhaps the member from Kamouraska may or may not have done the same thing, but I was quite impressed with the results. When you can reach 2,000, 4,000 people in an hour, this is really palatable. But I would have some technical questions. You gave the example of the Bell Initiative when they answered your invitation to try to identify issues, and I think that this has to be encouraged further. When private businesses that are able to self-discipline themselves, I think that this is a good initiative. Here's a few questions. When foreigners call, I'm talking about people who are calling from foreign countries, would it, not technically speaking and legally speaking, but would it be possible to stop at the source, that is for Canadian telephones, if you have if you can say everything that's offshore outside of Canada, well, it's just not going to be allowed in. Is it possible to have this type of measure? Technically speaking, is it even possible?
Techniquement,
Technically speaking, yes, it's a solution that's technically possible. The French have opted, or they have the stir-shaken model. In 2025, everything that will be international calls that won't be validated, well, they'll have to cut them. But this, I don't think it's a good way to have a good relationship with our neighbors to the south. But the technical means do exist, and I don't want to go back into the past either and answer the same questions. But if I had other means, it would be in this aspect that I would invest to see what can be done on a network level. What can be done to implement systems that would allow to detect and to better control, to better respond to these fears. Thank you. So, Mr. Scott, am I to understand that you're open to this suggestion? Is this a position that the CRTC could adopt? Mr. Gano, no, it's definitely not something that the CRTC has considered. What I'm saying is that with regards to the implementation of acts, we have a three-level approach. As Stephen was mentioning earlier, there's a limit to what we can do with the implementation. If we have more money, we'll be able to pursue more files, but in the end, we'll have more people working on the file, and that will be that. Also, we do a lot of awareness raising among small businesses, but also among seniors. And when we have a file that has an impact on vulnerable people, and you can see this in the next report, we spoke to this, and we do a lot of education. This is the second pillar, if you will, and the third one is that we work on a proactive basis. Everything that he spoke to, universal call blocking, Bell, the stir-shaken, the call trace back, all these things happen proactively. Another question I have, if we're purchasing or renting a phone, can we opt out of some things? That is to say, can we systematically refuse all robocalls? Can something be done? Is this done in other countries? Have all companies assessed this? What's your thoughts?
No, they're robocalls. Alain veut ajouter quelque chose?
Technically speaking, we don't know if they're robocalls. And so this is part of the methodology with stir-shaken. It's to add a measure. Yes, but
legislation in the world that has this is an opting out. If you don't want to have any robocall, you can have the application, and then that's it. That's all, folks. It's over.
Yeah, and the French model will look something like that in the future.
Okay.
The balancing act here is to try and block unwanted or illegitimate calls, but not to block legitimate ones. That's the challenge.
And that's
so you can say, yeah, we'll block everything that we're suspicious about, but that means we'll be blocking legitimate calls. And consumers do not want that. Consumers want illegitimate calls, so we're trying to equip them with the tools to give them trust in the system.
Mais c'est ce qui amène aussi beaucoup de personnes, moi le premier.
yes, but if I don't know who's calling me, I don't answer. I have voicemail for that. I don't answer. Yes. Do you see a difference between those who have, I suppose the majority of people have a mobile phone, and those who have landlines? Is there a difference in the fraudulent call levels? Or are fraudsters hitting everyone? No. There's no difference? Is that what you're saying? No, there's no difference. No huge difference. How can we distinguish between the legit and not legit calls? Calls that can be calls that we want and others that we don't. Some people might say, if I could refuse all, it would be simpler.
promotion.
Okay, here's my answer.
Sorry, if he can do that. Let me rephrase it, Stephen.
Too late. Non, c'est une très très bonne question.
It's an excellent question. Obviously, I cannot disclose some information that was obtained in the Bell file, but obviously, service providers do monitor their networks and they see things and they're able to detect, for example, if there are 12,000 calls a minute that are coming into 514, it's probably because there's something abnormal happening. So it's a huge indicator. Yes, but during an election, everyone was calling. Thousands of calls were being done simultaneously. Yes, but I'm talking about one same number generating 12,000 calls. Do you see what I'm saying? Yes, so on the network, they can see a number that is from any country.
Be a problem too.
Ça, vous voyez. Donc, mais évidemment, la loi sur les télécommunications canadiennes.
So the Canadian Telecommunications Act is comprised in the way that service providers do not have this freedom themselves. They have to ask permission, such as Bell did, to implement some mechanisms. Thank you very much. Mrs. Lapointe, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Earlier, you talked about one of the first intervention used is prevention and education. And so I'd like to know what kind of work the CRTC does with its partners to raise awareness about fraud calls.
Sure, and I'll ask Stephen to elaborate. He runs this group, but the obvious ones are communications with the public, and we do it in partnerships with various players. So I'll just quickly outline. So one, we have an intelligence gathering group that examines everything that goes through the Fraud Reporting Center and all the information we gather to identify, emerging campaigns. One of the members mentioned earlier, the day after the government announces a program, you get fraudulent calls in relation to that program. During tax season, we work closely with Canada Revenue Agency to remind people that the government of Canada doesn't threaten you by text message or over the phone with jail sentences or what have you. And an ongoing education campaign. We speak at universities, we speak at fraud conferences, at commercial conferences where telemarketers gather and so on. Stephen, rather than me bouncing around here, do you want to give a perhaps better response?
No problem. Yeah, and I think what's important is that we do engage various levels, whether it be, I always say Joe and Jane Canadian. We try to get that message out through some of our government partners, but we also talk to industry associations. I speak a lot at various conferences, as Ian said. But it's also working with, my colleagues at the Competition Bureau and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner when we see information, when we can help share between each other, but when we can support campaigns. October, which is just, I was going to say it's next week, it's anti-fraud month. So we'll be participating with CRA and the Competition Bureau and others who will be putting out messages on a regular basis. We have an amazing communications team at the CRTC, which gets messages out via our website, our social media channels, et cetera. So we try to be as active as we can in the space.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm thinking specifically about seniors. Those are the calls I mostly get in my constituency, who may not be on computers or have smartphones. How are you able to share or disseminate information to vulnerable population of seniors?
I'm not sure that we have an easy answer for that or a simple method to reach them. I can use my own example. Perhaps you're in a similar circumstance. My sister and I, give my elderly mother a lot of advice about what to answer and not to answer and to check with us on things. So if you will, you educate those to educate others. But you're right, for those who are perhaps new Canadians with less familiarity with French and English, some elderly population, we need to go through intermediaries. And we reach out as broadly as we can, but I won't pretend that we can reach everyone.
Are there particular types of calls that Canadians tend to fall victim to more than others? Do we know that?
Say, and Alain may want to add, I think it's a bit facile, and I apologize for that. The cleverest ones. I mean, they're very opportunistic, particularly if we're talking about fraud. They're very opportunistic. So when the government introduced an income support program in the midst of COVID, it took them a matter of hours to put out messages saying, this is where your name is on the list, and call this number or text here in order to get your rebate or whatever. Immediately after the Rogers outage, they were going, Rogers owes you money, text here or call here to get your refund. So they're very quick. Some of them are very sophisticated. We even within government, we have it. I've had employees with emails from me, apparently, and they're clever enough to go. I don't usually ask people to go out and buy thousands of dollars of iTunes cards, but we get questions, as do municipalities, about we need to wire money to cover, a contract or whatever. There's large scale and small scale, but they're clever. And they are very quick to take advantage of public announcements and so on. I think those are probably the most effective. Alain, do we keep specific statistics that you're aware of? You would know.
We have some, as Stephen mentioned, we have an intel shop whose role is to gather all the information. So we might, I wouldn't be surprised that we have. I don't have those stats with me at the moment, but I'm definitely, I have no worries to.
I'll undertake to have our staff look at it, and if we can provide a better response, we'll send it to the committee clerk, if that's okay.
I appreciate that. And I just want to touch upon MP Massey's point about individuals who, the number of individuals who actually report scams is quite low. And I'd be interested to know, in your opinion, why do you think that is? And secondly, would an increase in reporting help the CRTC and its partners address those challenges that we currently face with fraud calls?
The second point, yes. The more information we have, the more specifics we have about the nature of campaigns, the nature of the calls, the better armed and prepared we are to educate consumers, to put law enforcement or other parts of government on notice and the public on notice. So absolutely, the more information, the better. On the first part of the question, Stephen, sorry, go ahead.
On your first part of your question, on the telemarketing side, we receive about 3,000 complaints a month. On the spam side, so that's your SMS, text, or your emails, I get about 5,000 a week. So we are not shy of complaints. But you're right, Canadians consistently underreport, right? They're either embarrassed if they've fallen for a scheme, or they just don't want to go through the motions of actually reporting it. But that's why, my intelligence teams use those complaints, but that's why we talk to service providers, that's why we talk to the banks, that's why we talk to other, areas that have information on what Canadians are complaining about, so that we can kind of slice and dice that and see where the common threads are and see where the common campaigns are and see if, A, there's something we can do about it, or if one of my partners can do something about it.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur Lemire pour.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back on smaller operators, because I'm trying to understand, can they follow the cadence? Can they invest as much as larger service providers? Do you think that their capacity is good to protect their clients compared to larger providers? I think so, actually. Alain? Yes. First of all, the new entrants are usually on the IP network, so it's not an extra burden. And for those who were not, definitely for them, they can rely on their upstream provider that will cover this aspect for them. Up until now, we've received no complaints. Personally, I'm not aware of any provider that has said that it was too much of a burden. On the contrary, the only issue is more or less to understand that so that stir shaken will work, you need to have technical capabilities, the software, the switches, but you need an IP interconnection. So you need the interconnection agreement. And sometimes this is where smaller providers have to wait a little bit longer. And normally, I mean, I'm using Bell or TELUS as an example. The larger players, they're going to reach an agreement with the larger ones before going to the smaller providers. So they have a little bit more of a wait time. So if we look at what happened last summer with the Rogers outage, Minister Champagne imposed better collaboration between the network providers, and this outage showed the limits of our system. How can the other players perhaps assist a provider that might have shortfalls in the context of fraud? Can this be applied? It's not exactly the same thing. The subject is different. The efforts of the minister
measures are to protect against outages. The focus is not there on sharing of information of this type, but there is cooperation within the industry to combat this. Est-ce que c'est assez pour répondre à votre question?
Does this answer your question? For now, but I understand that there's work that remains to be done, but as a whole, is there a concrete action plan that was put forth to ensure that our networks will be modernized? Also, resilience is important to improve the security level. Are we trending towards this?
Focusing on the issue of the robustness and integrity of networks. That really falls first and foremost to the industry department, to ISED. They work with the industry. They deal with natural disasters, emergencies. They operate the CSTAC committee. So it really is they who are responsible for that. Our role as the regulator of their business, is that's not so much our role. With respect to telemarketing, it's the other way around. It's very much us and us working with the carriers. But I would say on both fronts, there are both plans and cooperation between industry participants.
Une des recommandations qui était
One of the recommendations made by the committee 2 years ago said that the Government of Canada launch a 1-month awareness campaign with the public so that the Canadians will be warned against fraud, especially called fraud linked to COVID. Do you know if this recommendation was put forth and what actions happen in order to raise awareness among the public so they would be less vulnerable to attacks? The Council works with the Competition Bureau. The Commission works in order to prevent fraud. And these fraudulent activities highlighted early in the pandemic, we sent a message to Canadians. So yes, we did have these meetings and we did have calls with the CRA and other agencies in order to coordinate our efforts. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. And once again, congratulations for your ability to respect the time. Better than anyone else around the table today, actually. Thank you. It makes my job a lot easier. Mr. Massé, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the heads up warning.
I thought it was directed at me, Mr. Mass, not you.
Yeah, it's all good. You mentioned collaboration about the industry. So is there a formal working group in the industry? And what CEOs or staff have they assigned? Are you part of those discussions? Give us a little more detail as to what's going on in the industry.
Let me ask Mr. Haroon to respond to that. He's more in touch with it on a day-to-day basis.
No, absolutely, and thanks for the question. All the major providers, even some of the smaller providers, participate in a couple different working groups at the staff level. So we have the right technical folks on board. We have the right regulatory folks on board when necessary. It is more of a technical group. We look at the intelligence that they're seeing, with respect to their networks, what kind of traffic they're seeing, et cetera. They meet on a weekly basis, and on a monthly and a quarterly basis, we actually have a larger group, which we call the voice telephony group, which talks about all the issues within that area.
So would it be helpful at this point in time to kind of heighten or increase the responsibility on the carriers to also make this more public and at a more senior level as well? I think that, if there's going to be some more awareness, if it's a bunch of, IT people meeting, on Zoom, it's one thing and it gets real results, but also too, is there something more we can do on the culture of this with regards to the telcos?
Very actively engaged.
Your mic.
The telcos are definitely very actively engaged with us at the more senior levels. Obviously, that's at your discretion to ask them to make that more public and ask them to inform their consumers more. I will say, I've mentioned before of all the different partnerships we have. The telcos, the banks, and others are very active in the space in informing their customers when there's a fraud. They all have, blinking lights on their website. This is the latest scam, and unfortunately, that changes probably on a weekly basis. They all are very public facing. Could they do more? Could we all do more? Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and the reason I asked about the fines and the penalties is because, at the end of the day, a fraud call, whether it's done by a carrier that is stretching the rules or whether it's an outright organized crime thing, is still the same results upon the victim. And the reason the penalties, you mentioned in your testimony about, this is what I'm trying to get to, is that for $10 million, you mentioned that number, that was your number. I'd like to know, what does that buy for the public in terms of improved crackdown or stopping fraud calls? Like, what type of an investment in return do we get on that? That's what I'm really seeking with regards to even having this come back to Parliament here, is how far we've come, but also to where we can go. And so you mentioned $10 million. What does that actually gain for our economy and our consumers and public protection?
I'm trying to think of the specific reference, and I'm not being disagreeable, Mr. Mass, but I think, Stephen, you mentioned even if I had $10 million, it would be. That wasn't the point of that. Okay. I think there are different issues here. So the telemarketing.
I'm just going to interrupt because I have a bit of time, but I just want to say this, and all I'm looking for, and this will be my final thing, is just hopefully if you could come back with us give us a picture as to if we had some improvements, what it would cost the CRTC, and if we invested in that and what our return might be. You don't have to come up with it now, but that's what I'm looking for. Is that okay if we help with these things, just like the communication piece where you still don't get the proper communication because of sharing of information laws? I'm looking to see where we get value out of that. And so if you do missing some things later on, we'd love to hear that back, because that's what I'm looking for, is how do we exercise that, and how do we give you the proper supports to get the results, if you can.
That's a very fair request, and we'll certainly consider that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé. Je passerai la parole à Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Canada's Anti-Fraud Centre received over 50,000 fraud reports. For the Canada Anti-Fraud Centre, have fraud reported for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and apparently only 15% of cases were sent to the police. I don't know how Statistics Canada knows that only 13% of frauds are reported, but if it's only 13% that's reported and this represents 50,000 fraud reports, it means that we're talking here about potentially billions of dollars in fraud in terms of the value. Am I calculating this correctly? Is my assessment correct? Yes. 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 Yes, you are. You're totally correct. Once again, as Ian said, it's not our role to have this information, but this, in fact, is what we're hearing from other agencies. only 10 to 15% of victims are reporting for different reasons. As Ian was saying, either they're embarrassed or they believe that they will never be able to recoup the money. For whatever reason, there's a large percentage of people, and sometimes they'll just absorb the loss as a lesson learned. And yes, that's true. So we're talking about people who were victims of fraud, not people who where there was an attempt. We're talking about people who were victims of fraud. So the financial assessment of this, if I understand things correctly, is it's a very, very large number. So in the light of these figures, because we're talking here about telephone fraud, but today, with the phones that we have, of course, we receive hundreds of text messages, and this on a regular basis. This doesn't happen with landlines, of course. Do you see an evolution of fraud attempts? Well, we've been working with these for 25 years, so I imagine have you seen an increase of fraud? Not just for phone fraud with telemarketers, but also using text messages. Do you deal with this, text messaging? Yes. As Mr. Scott was saying, CASTLE is the act that deals with junk mail or text messages. And yes, we do deal with this at the CRTC. It's another team. It's not my team that deals with it. But to answer your question, it always comes back to the same thing. Yes, whether it be telephone fraud, using a voice or a text message, the ultimate goal is the same. It is to obtain personal information of the person and then to either sell it or to extort funds or to use it to some financial gain. Mr. Dong and Mrs. Lapointe and I have spoken about the CRA. In your opinion, is this the agency that is the most targeted, if you will, by fraudsters? Well, it's a trend right now. For example, when it's a tax time, there's probably a lot of increase using CRA, but there's also CBSA has been targeted a lot as well. Amazon. So all these tactics are being used, and yes, there has been an evolution. Mr. Scott was mentioning, even before coming here, that what we call the Mandarin scam, initially it was only in Mandarin. You would answer the phone, the other person would speak in Mandarin, so it was easy, actually. But most people would just hang up. So that scam was targeting Asian citizens, and they were using language for extortion. This time, there was an English and Mandarin option. You could choose. If you wanted to hear the English, you could press a number and Mandarin for the other. So they improved their tactics. So since the beginning, you talked about information, of raising awareness, and you say that you have conferences and that you do a lot of training and information sharing. I'm from a region, we're not all in Canadian downtown, so some of us are in regions. So how do you have conferences with specialists? I've never seen you at La Pocatière or at Rivière-du-Loup. So do you use the local media, regional media? How do you raise awareness? I've already seen ads. This summer, I believe that CRA has its own announcements, if I'm not wrong, to avoid fraud. Yes, we're all working together. We have messages on our website, as you're saying. Also, CRA is doing their part. Stephen is working with business owners and businesses. So our message is being disseminated throughout. Sorry to cut you off. I very rarely go on your website, but the population in general needs to be informed through traditional media. Same for elderly people. I also receive calls from people in my county. These are people living at home, and they still have landlines, and they receive calls on the landline and not through the internet or through a smartphone. So these people need to be informed using traditional media. Do you still do this? Are you continuing to do this? Yes. I'd like to back up a little bit. I believe that Mr. Arun explained this. Telemarketing, well, there's an aspect that has to be commercial to this. So either legitimate or non-legitimate businesses, but there has to be a product or a service that's being marketed. So if we refer to calls that might be more criminal nature, of a criminal nature, it's as if you were using the telecommunications network to commit a crime. So what I'm saying is that this is not necessarily within the purview of the CRTC. It's as if we were saying if somebody who's driving a minivan, a Dodge minivan, to commit a holdup, well, we should ask the dealership to do something. Do you see what I'm saying? At some point, the vector is a telecommunications network, but the crime committed, our mandate stops at the civil level. So what you're saying is that you don't consider that it's your responsibility to tell the population in general, and more specifically seniors, that crimes might be committed, fraud through phone lines, through texts. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at? There's a part of the population that is vulnerable, and I'm very curious to know if we look at the people that are reporting to the police, I imagine that a large number of them are seniors. This is a category of the population that is at a higher risk than young people who are able to tell the difference. Well, I can, but I receive these types of texts, but not everybody is savvy enough to know the difference. Do you have a way, or do you have terminology or something for these people in particular, this population? I understand what you're trying to get at, and I understand your desire, and it's mine as well. For example, recently, I was on a plane, and I was speaking to an older lady, and I indicated, is it possible for students in a school to speak with older people? Or is it possible in a community center for people who don't speak French or English to... is it possible to do something? Prevention is important. This is my goal in the end for all Canadians.
Prevent Canadians from falling, suspect to these things. I've done my job. It's not about an amp. It's not about compliance. It's at the end of the day, it's education. You have not, fallen victim.
If I can very briefly add, your point is well, no, and I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman. Your point's well taken, and I think we can do better. We do things on public radio and so on, but you're right. I'm taking note of it, that there are using conventional media, using other vehicles to get those same messages out is a desirable thing, and we can and should do better.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Généreux.
Thank you, Mr. Généreux. And I liked in your question, Mr. Généreux, when you said that the older people were more vulnerable, but the younger people were more savvy. And you said that you were not really vulnerable to that. I always thought of you as being savvy and young.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for making time for the committee. So I did want to underscore, for the sake of the committee, one more time how important this issue is, and that it's not just nuisance calls. I know of cases before I entered politics where seniors from ethnic backgrounds, from minority ethnic backgrounds, were targeted in their native language. They were told that that within an hour they had to deposit X amount of money, otherwise they would lose their citizenship or lose their PR card. And they actually did that. And I know of one particular case actually where the individual then committed suicide from the embarrassment of the entire ordeal. So it's a very serious issue. Mr. Scott, so you spoke a little bit about the international cooperation that happens between your organization and your international counterparts. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more? I feel like we're bringing a lot of people into the country every single year, and we need to take care of them and protect them because they're vulnerable. So what's the cooperation that's happening?
First, I want to reiterate that is, I believe, the second member that's made the point that this isn't just about nuisance, and you're absolutely right. This is very serious. The numbers that the member quoted in terms of potential amounts associated with fraud are huge, and the societal impact is huge. That's why we are seized of this issue. So you will have no disagreement from us. What we try and do, as I said earlier, with international organizations is share best practices, leverage our knowledge, cooperate. So I'll give you a quick example. We recently signed a new memorandum of understanding with the Australian regulator, and in part that's because the frequency of these calls is now increasing in Australia. And they're sometimes different in tactics, but the overall sort of patterns are similar. So we'll share with them information to the extent we're allowed on investigative techniques, enforcement techniques, ways to the intelligence we gather, how to best proactively deal with it. I'll give you a second example. The new recently named chair at the FCC and I have met twice now, and she has one of her focuses, as did her predecessor, robocalls, as they tend to refer to them in the U.S. And we're working together, and for example, we're going to try and enhance our call trace activities. So we can identify and trace calls and go, okay, they're coming into Canada from the United States or from another country. Likewise, we can work with the United States to go, if it's coming in from the United States, where did it start? And then we get to the next door, so to speak, and they are working to then close those doors with their providers. So it's a combination of sharing intelligence, tactics that are working, identifying patterns. And the last point I'll make is, and then when we talk about criminal activity, and there is criminal activity in certain of these situations, then it's a question of finding the ability to pursue those matters, whether it's in the United States or in an Asian country or wherever, because at the source it may be in another country, and we have to get enforcement actions taken there, and that's a challenge.
So that actually feeds into my next question. The examples, again, I'm going off the examples that I know of. There were centers set up actually in Pakistan where an entire call center is dedicated just for making fraud calls, and it's turned into a money-making operation. So far, the countries that you've spoken about where there is cooperation, I think you mentioned America, you mentioned Australia. Is there any cooperation that happens with South Asian countries, for example?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't point to one particular country or another. There are many countries. The majority of telemarketing generally between Canada and the United States is across border, not from abroad. But I just want to be clear.
Sorry, just to interrupt. The reason I bring it up is because my constituents are sort of affected by that region. That's why I brought it up.
I understand. I'm just always hesitant to go calls coming from a particular part of the world. They come from a lot of parts, and nefarious actors can be located anywhere and use technology from anywhere. But you're quite right. There are examples there and elsewhere. But there are two different things here. So we're working with like-minded agencies, and yes, we've dealt with the Indian telecoms regulator, for example. I don't know if we've had direct engagement with, for example, Pakistan's authorities, but we also work within organizations like the International Institute of Communications that has regulators from around the world. We're hosting a meeting of them here in Ottawa in November, and we raised those issues there. There's a difference between sharing information and practices with fellow regulatory agencies, and then the other thing you're talking about is enforcing the law. And that we have to hand over to law enforcement agencies and the Justice Department to pursue and to encourage their international counterparts to pursue. That's beyond our jurisdiction and our reach, so to speak.
So, as a lawyer, I do understand the executive is in charge of enforcement. From what you're saying, it seems like the CRTC lacks teeth to sort of to go after this fully, and it's law enforcement that has to come in and get the job done. Is there sort of, and I think this question was asked before as well, is there communication back and forth if information is passed on of a specific complaint? Do you get a report back of what happened in let's say a month's time, 6 months' time, a year's time?
Short answer to that, and it's a bit unfair, would be no. As Mr. Haroon explained before, or pardon me, it may have been my other colleague, we're not a law enforcement agency in that sense. We're not enforcing criminal law. So we have to hand those things off where we identify it. The area, and Mr. Math and I talked about this briefly, where we could use some legislative help, for lack of a better term, is to expand our ability to share information in both directions. And that would be helpful so that we can assist law enforcement agencies in their work. But they do, I do have to sort of draw a line. They do their work and we do ours.
Thank you very much. Did you have another question? No.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll move to MP Gray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Scott, I wanted to focus my questions today around an issue that was brought forward during our previous industry committee study in this area, the SIM swapping and phone porting scam. And what actions has the CRTC taken to prevent either of these types of fraud from taking place since that study took place?
Thank you for the question. I didn't bring statistics with me today. But the short answer is that the industry has taken numerous steps, and the results have been very encouraging. So the numbers of SIM swapping activities have drastically declined. I don't know, Stephen, if you have the numbers on top of mind. We have a lot of the industry's work was done cooperatively under the banner of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. And they said they would introduce measures through their members to add additional layers of protection. They've agreed to various measures and they cooperate, and those measures have resulted in a significant reduction. Hasn't eliminated the problem. I mean, there's always opportunistic actors, but it's vastly improved. I didn't bring those statistics with me, but we certainly, I can confirm that the problem is significantly lessened. I'll just use that word.
Great, thank you very much. And as you said, if that's something that you'd be able to table for this committee, that information, if you've got that would be appreciated.
We'd be able to give some numbers in the aggregate, not broken down, for the very reason that we don't want to bad actors and nefarious players to be able to use disaggregated information to figure out who best to target. So to the extent we release that information, we do it on an aggregated basis, if that's acceptable to members.
Great, thank you very much. And then also on that note, can you table for the committee, broken down by month, since August of 2019 to now, the number of phone porting and SIM swapping cases of fraud logged by the CRTC as well? Do you have that information?
I think, and I'd have to check, that type of disaggregated information we would not disclose.
Okay. Do you have general, if
we-
it's not broken down in that detail?
What I will undertake to do is to look at the numbers that we have and provide the committee with everything we can on an aggregated basis, if that would be helpful.
Great, thank you very much. One of the things that you had mentioned in your opening address actually was around AI. And this committee undertook a study on quantum computing and, just how that's emerging. And the study is now complete, but there were a lot of concerns brought forth on that, specifically around security risks. And so, what do you have any information? Is this something that you're looking at? We know that this is emerging, and what impacts could this have in this area of that we're talking about today with the fraud calls? And are there ways that you're preparing for this?
If you're going to ask me to speak to the issue of quantum physics, I think I'm going to duck, and I'm not even sure I can hand that off. I don't even think I can call a friend. If I can try this, when we approved the trial for Bell and ultimately approved a service, the biggest challenge we received, one, were concerns about privacy, and two, were concerns, if you will, about false positives, the potential for blocking out legitimate calls. And the trial showed that there were virtually no accidental or erroneous blockages. And so that's why after seeing, a full evidence of the trial, we approved it. I have not heard of any application beyond that. Nothing has been brought to the commission at this point. But I would suggest that we would approach any such project or proposal the same way that we approached the Bell project. We would want to look at it, have a public proceeding, get the opinion of the privacy commissioner, advocates for privacy, any other academic or professional concerns about strengths and weaknesses, develop a record, and then make a decision. So we would be open. We're open to every solution, that the industry and individuals could bring to us, and then we'll see it tested before we allowed for its application. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thank you. Well, it seems like there. If I'm hearing what you're saying is that you haven't really started on anything like that.
I have not heard using quantum computing in this area at all. Just a quick check with my colleagues. No, not to date. But if you have one, we will hear it.
Thank you very much. We'll now move for our last questioner to MP Erskine Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Joel. Mr. Scott, this was a while ago when we had a different chair, and it was I think Brian and I were members of the committee. I'm not sure if anyone else was still a member of the committee when we undertook the Fraudulent Calls in Canada study. The title is Fraudulent Calls in Canada, Federal Government's First Start. I just want to make sure, so have you and your team reviewed that study?
You're referring to the committee's report? Yes.
That's correct, yeah.
Yes, we have.
Now, the government's obligated to respond. The government's responded and pointed to some work that they're doing, and there has been work, credibly, to address this issue. From the CRTC's perspective, when you looked at the recommendations that the committee made, have, in the interest of time, because we don't have much time, would it be possible to get a clearer sense in writing following up to have a better sense of the CRTC's perspective in terms of how they've responded in some cases to the recommendation, or where the issues that we were highlighting, where the CRTC is acting in relation to them? Would it be possible to have a more fulsome response in writing that is akin to a response to the report, to go through recommendations where they're relevant to the CRTC, so we have a better understanding of actions that the CRTC has undertaken?
I'm glad you added the last part. I would be pleased to undertake to respond, to describe various measures, as we've tried to do today, that the CRTC has taken that are responsive in some way to the recommendations of the committee. I'd be pleased to do that. You'll understand it's not my place to respond on behalf of the government, but certainly on behalf of
exactly.
our agency,
I wouldn't ask you to.
I'd be happy to provide you with a sort of summary of the things that we've done that we believe are responsive to issues raised in the report germane to our jurisdiction.
I would appreciate that. And the only addendum I think is, I'll use recommendation 12 and 13 as an example in relation to the CRTC. This is a while ago now that we did this, so it's not right. The details of this aren't in front of me at the moment in quite the same way as they were when we went through this the very first time. But the Government of Canada support efforts by the CRTC to conduct a public inquiry into unauthorized porting. And then recommendation 13 was, should the CRTC not launch a public inquiry into unauthorized porting within 6 months, that the Government of Canada introduce legislation to protect Canadians against unauthorized porting. So just, you wouldn't have to respond specifically to those recommendations, just it would be responding on the question of unauthorized porting and the work that you've done in relation to a public inquiry or other work that you would have done. So that would be the kind of response that I think would be helpful in writing. And then the only other question that I had was in relation to your work when you look at this is not a Canadian problem uniquely, this is a problem that exists all around the world, and you identify this as a challenge in other English-speaking countries, French-speaking countries. I think you also pointed to Asia being a hotspot of fraud calls. Are other jurisdictions adopting best practices that you think the CRTC should be seriously looking at? And where would you point to around the world in addressing this global challenge where other jurisdictions are doing this better than we are or are engaging in best practices that we could adopt here at home?
Well, without being immodest, I'd hope that the reason we develop those relationships and partner with those agencies is so that we can learn from them, and hopefully they learn from us. And I think we've been doing that. I'd be honest, I would say perhaps the most aggressive and advanced player in this regard are our colleagues south of the border. And we have very close contact. And I guess what I would say is within the confines of our legislative schemes, we have adopted all of the best practices that we've identified.
I appreciate that. And I guess the other thing that would be useful probably in writing to follow up on is, and south of the border is maybe the best example, but where you've identified practices that are worth pursuing, that other countries are pursuing, that the CRTC is as a result pursuing. One, it would be a good for us to understand the work that the CRTC has done to improve its own measures, with the template being we consulted with folks south of the border, and here are steps we undertook to follow their model. Or if that work isn't fully completed in some cases, understanding the status of the work and following through on best practices that you found in other parts of the world. And where it's directly relevant to your work, I think that's very helpful. If in the course of undertaking some of your work, and as you say, it's within your legislative scheme, but if there are other best practices that you've come across as a result of your relationships that isn't specific to the CRTC, but maybe for another agency to pursue, that may also be helpful for the committee's purposes. But it may not be that you've got that long list because it's not necessarily for within your purview. But that would be a useful follow-up, I think, in writing as well, to have a sense of how you are learning from and responding to best practices elsewhere.
Thank you. We'll do our best. It's kind of like a progress report and a wish list. I'm not trying to in any way minimize, but I think that's in essence what you're asking for. Just quickly in relation, but I do want to be a bit clear. So the two recommendations, for example, that you made reference to had to do with porting, which was at the time a growing and a problem we were all aware of. An example of that would be, there we asked and pushed the industry to do something about it, and they did.
Yes.
And they did without us having to have a public proceeding, and the measures that they've taken have been successful. And so obviously we have proceedings, we have a lot of things to do and a lot of important work to do. So we're not going to do a proceeding where we think a problem is resolved or at least on its way to being addressed.
Understandable, and I use that only as an example to say,
understood.
We've identified an issue, and you may identify the way you would identify the way you've addressed that issue, and so the recommendation is speaking to something for the CRTC within the CRTC's purview, and then you would respond to us to say, this is how we've addressed it.
I
This is how we
understood,
think
and that's exactly, we're saying the same thing, or we're in violent
exactly.
agreement. I want to say we have addressed it. We addressed it by telling the industry we wanted them to address it, and they did. Or they are
exactly.
continuing to,
Exactly.
and that's been good progress. And on the other one, we will do our best, and we'll try and keep our list modest and
good.
reasonable. And I appreciate the question in terms of what can we do better, and what other practices could we apply if we had some additional flexibility, and we'll take it in that spirit. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Thank you, Nate. So we still have a bit of time, and I know MP Dong has, I think, one or two more questions, so you can go ahead. And if anyone else has more
If
questions.
he's going to ask about quantum computing, I'm leaving.
Actually, that was my motion to study quantum computing, but I won't ask that today. I'm just trying to get my head around how to breaking down the silo that you were talking about. So I assume that if Rogers or Bell, that they spot some suspicious activities, are they allowed to pass on that? Or are they required to pass on that information to CRTC? Like, otherwise, how would you know that there is suspicious activities going on? Because they're the service provider.
That's
right?
a very complicated question, more complicated than you might imagine. So carriers can do certain things. Look, if they're aware, I'll use the example of malformed numbers.
I'm just talking about like fraudulent calls. They receive a complaint from the customer.
But it's not a question of complaints here. It really is. We're talking about, or at least what I was talking about, is actions the companies can take when they know there are things coming across their system that may be fraudulent. And they have to be careful, because they're not allowed to influence, under the Telecom Act, the content of the messages. And from a privacy perspective and just a civil society perspective, we don't want phone companies poking inside the messages and going, I don't think we should let that one through, but this one's okay.
Yeah, but when they tag this as a possible fraudulent call,
then they would have to come to us. And the example of how Bell developed a potential approach to deal with fundamentally what we call WGIRI calls. It was a callback schemes to generate revenue from international accounting settlements. They have to come to us and say, can we apply this technology? And in that case, they said, could we do a trial and apply this technology to see if we can screen out calls in this way? And we gave them permission to do it on a temporary basis, following a public proceeding where we got input, and then we gave it a permanent approval because they demonstrated there were not errors, and it was effective.
Okay, but what do they do when they spot something, when they tag something that might be a criminal fraudulent?
We have to separate criminal from what they believe are not are not legitimate calls or patterns.
So what would they do? I have limited time.
What they should be doing, and I mean that's what I said. It's a delicate question. Can they take some measures on their own? They might, but they have to be very careful, because there are very clear lines drawn in the Telecom Act.
So let me ask you.
So they got to come to us and ask us.
So why? So if they can give those information or tag these information of these tag calls to you, why can they give that information to RCMP?
We're mixing. If I'm understanding the question well, we're mixing different concepts. They don't know that it's a fraudulent call. What we're dealing with here, if we took spoofing, I guess actually I'll go back to the Bell example. That's a system where they're getting callbacks. They're calling numbers, and then they get a callback because people do it automatically, and then they get money. People are making money on the international accounting settlements. I won't go into the details. But they're irregular. You shouldn't be getting thousands of calls from a place. So it's the pattern of calls that they're dealing with. And that is when they'll come and say, we're seeing this pattern. and we know they're not legitimate calls.
So under the current legislation, can they go to RCMP and say the same thing?
But they could, but they don't know what's happening. They don't know. They can't go inside those calls and
Right.
listen or know what's going on. So they're coming to us as the regulator to say, we think these calls are illegitimate and we want to take measures.
That's not my question. My question, under the current law, can they go to RCMP?
They could go to the RCMP, but they would be telling them that we're getting a whole bunch of calls using this number pattern, which doesn't mean anything to the CRTC.
Okay.
It
so
means something
the reason
to
why
us.
for my question is that we'll be seeing RCMP on Monday. So I'll
They
ask them the
couldn't
same
deal
question.
with that. So I'll just very quickly go back to the idea of malformed numbers. If you're getting numbers that aren't real phone numbers, full of a bunch of zeros, because scammers are sending calls through the system using phony numbers, or they're all fives, or they're all fours. It doesn't matter what it was. They know that that's not a real call. If that went to the RCMP, it's not a crime to try and use all
Well,
fours
I'm
to
trying
go
to
through.
find a way to break down silos and try to really understand what we can do for information to flow, right? Because today we're hearing from you that you are not a law enforcement body. You want to pass on this information. I'm sure the RCMP will say that we don't have access to this information, right? There's like a door in between the two agencies, and it's who's going to open that door, right? So what I'm saying
I
is,
agree, and Stephen, maybe you can speak
but my
briefly
point is
to
that
the
you don't collect information. Like you're not the service provider, right? So the service provider are flagging these calls to you. Why can they flag these? Or I understand that you just explained the pattern now.
different issues. They're flagging to us these are malformed numbers or
Right.
whatever. Our intelligence group is flagging things like, wait, there's a spam campaign. There's a campaign going on that looks like it's fraudulent. We see it. We're getting complaints. They come through the spam reporting center, and our intelligence group identifies perhaps where it's coming from. And Stephen, you can add to this. And then that's the stuff that we want to report to the RCMP going, we think there's a fraud campaign going
And
on.
currently you can't do that.
Well, we can to a point. Stephen?
Yeah, we can in aggregate, and that's what we share. And our telcos are on those calls as well with the RCMP and the Canadian Anti-Fraud Center. We share aggregate information about campaigns that we're seeing, campaigns that the telcos are seeing. To your specific, question earlier, I mean, I'm well familiar with the TSPs and the fraud departments that they have, and the number of resources they have. I am certain if they, have complaints from a particular customer on being victimized, et cetera, there's a process for them to deal with that. Either the complainant can deal with that with law enforcement officials, or Rogers may or may not, and I use their name, vicariously, with the RCMP as well. So I think there are specific complaints where someone's been victimized, where of course there are methods, through the criminal system. I think the challenge we face, and even that we face as, as CRTC, and say, we're seeing these campaigns, we're seeing these types of things that we pass along. My colleagues at the RCMP, which we appeared beside the last time in March, they were sitting right beside us, that is one pile of a very big pile of cases that the RCMP has to look at, right? So, but I'm sure there are ways, but for us, it's the details that we can't share. We can share aggregate information. We can get everybody on a call saying, yes, we're seeing this type of activity, these type of things, but we can't share the specifics. But to your point about that Rogers or Bell or TELUS or whatever customer being victimized, for sure there is a process for them to deal with that as well. But that's very separate from us, right? But that goes to your criminal point.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Dong. Mr. Haroun, we'll move to Monsieur Lemire.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to highlight Brian Massey's leadership on this issue. And also, my colleague, Mr. Erskine Smith, 2 years ago, we looked at this, but sometimes parliamentary life speeds along. I'd like to ask a question with regards to recommendation 9 of the last report, where the government asks the CRTC to follow closely the cost of solutions to counteract fraudulent calls and the impact on affordability. do you observe or do you have any fears that some measures might be, that some costs might be imposed on consumers to fight fraudulent calls?
Sur la base des
On the basis of the information that we've received when we sent out consultation notices, no, this was never raised. And so most of the time, costs are not network costs. There was nothing that was specific, and there was nothing that was engendering extra costs other than to abiding by the Act. And so we have to see, sometimes the Commission, the CRTC asks things of industry, and sometimes the industry isn't sure, but they understand it's not always a question of cost. It's also a win-win situation. It's better for them as well. Their network won't be as clogged up with all these calls, and also they're able to provide better service to their clients. So in the end, the market does dictate those who will be the most proactive. So there's not really any extra costs. If I might add something, if you'll allow me.
I think also part of the route, and it may have been Mr. Mass in previous meetings that raised this, and I think there's a concern about as we impose constraints or direct phone companies to take measures, that we need to be very attentive that the costs of implementing those measures are not immediately passed on to consumers. And I think that's a very important point and one that we're paying close attention to. So thus far, I have not seen any measures that the companies have introduced where they are saying, we can protect you, we've got a great new gadget, approach that will get rid of most of the spam calls, and it's only an extra $2 a month on your cell bill or on your phone bill. We have not seen that, and I can at least speak for myself to say I wouldn't be very supportive as a regulator of such an approach by the carriers. I think it is in their interests to address this, and they should compete with one another for their customers in part on how well they protect them and serve them, not just their quality of service or their coverage, but also things like protecting them from unwanted communications. And I think it's in their best interest, but also we should make sure it's not at the expense of consumers. So I think that's part of what underlies that, and I'm not being very subtle, but I can say that I would not be supportive of seeing, let me rephrase it, I have expectations that the industry should deal with this because it's in their best interest and the best interests of consumers.
Merci, vous avez répondu à ma question, ma sous-question.
Thank you, you answered my question.
Donc, ça conclut le temps qu'on avait pour cette rencontre. Merci beaucoup, M. Garneau, M. Scott, M. Haroun, de vous être joints à nous. Et on attend, au nom du comité, les engagements que vous avez pris par écrit, les réponses que vous devez fournir au comité. C'est très apprécié. Et sur ce, bonne soirée tout le monde. Cette rencontre est à journée.